Okay, this is Business 436. The document is from Topic 18, and it's called Exit Preferences as Special Economic Terms, but what you want to really refer to it as liquidation preferences and participating preferred stock, because that's what you'll want to study for it. This won't make any sense for you. Okay, so what it says, he's got some major mistakes in this thing. It says, we will distinguish between liquidation preference and participating preferred stock. Although they're often used interchangeably, they are two different things. The term liquidation preference should pertain only to money returned to a particular series of company stocks ahead of other series of stocks. For instance, if a company liquidates, the order in which certain types of stocks are paid. For instance, we know that a preferred stock is paid for before a common stock. Okay, that's what the liquidation preferences has to do. Debt holders are paid first, preferred stockholders are paid next, and then different types of, and then common stock holders are paid. But there's A, B, and C stocks, so it gets a little bit complicated. But that's basically the way it goes. Debt holders are paid first, preferred stockholders, which are like debt, right, are paid next, and then common stockholders are paid. That's when the company is liquidated, like if it goes bankrupt or something like that, or if the company's sold. Not an IPO. An IPO is just where you're getting additional financing by going public. That's not a liquidation. The company's not dissolving. It's not being sold. It's not going bankrupt. It's just going public. And so it's getting additional financing that way. Where participating for preferred stock refers to separate extra return after the liquidation preference clause, if any, is available when the liquidation preference clause is executed. So this is just participating for preferred stock just refers to different extra money that the preferred stock gets when it goes through liquidation. So liquidation preference says debt first, preferred stocks next, and then common stocks. Participating preferred stock is, okay, once you've paid off the debt payers, then there's money to go with the preferred stocks. Some of those preferred stocks might have little clauses that add extra money that they get during the liquidation. Okay, so it says, what is a liquidation preference? And then here's a clause that you can read. Example, liquidation preference. Liquidation preference: in the event of any liquidation or winding up of the companies, the holders of Series A preferred shall be entitled to receive in preference of the holder of common stock. Now, the debt gets paid before this, but they're just talking about stock. So Series A preferred gets paid before common stock. An amount, a per share amount equal to X times, so 1 time, 2 times, whatever that would be. So in this case, let's just say 1 times the original purchase price plus any declared but unpaid dividends. So that's the liquidation preference, the preferable order, the order in which you get these stocks get preference in getting money. Because remember, if a company goes bankrupt, there's only enough money to pay the preferred stockholders and not the common stockholders. Common stockholders will get nothing then, or they might get partial. So the debt holders get paid first if there's enough. Say a company went bankrupt and they sold all the assets. The debt holders get paid first. Now, if there's money left, preferred stockholders get paid, partially or all. If there's enough to pay them completely, then the common stockholders get paid. So that's what the liquidation preference is all about. In this case, they're just talking about the stock preference. What is a liquidation event? So here's a sample clause: a merger, an acquisition, sale of voting control, or a sale of substantially all the assets of a company in which the shareholders of the companies do not own a majority of the outstanding shares of the surviving corporation. That shall be deemed a liquidation event. An IPO is not a liquidation event, and generally no preferential returns, liquidation preferences of participating stock, occur in an IPO. Because an IPO, basically, you're taking the company public, so everybody gets paid, but it's not a liquidation event. It just says IPOs are another funding event. Liquidation events, which create liquidity. You know, you're selling the assets to get cash to pay off the debt and the shareholders. So liquidation events create liquidity for the stock, or a company sale, or negative, like a bankruptcy. Those are examples of liquidity. An IPO is not a liquidation event, it's just a funding event. How does liquidation preference work? Okay, so let's go through this example. Liquidation preference directs the first portion of any proceeds directly to the investor until it has been satisfied. Then the remaining portion is distributed ratably, proportionate to the actual ownership percentage. So let's take an example. VC invests $3 million in the company for 33% ownership. The company sells for $9 million, sells to another company. So they're not going to have ownership. Some other companies bought them out, right? So now these guys don't have any shares anymore. So the first $3 million goes to the VC, right? Because that's his $3 million return. But he owned 33% of the company. So he gets his $3 million back. That's a 1 times, 1x, right? He gets his $3 million back, and then since he owns 33%, he owns 33% of what remains. So he gets his $3 million. There's $6 million remaining. He gets 33% of that. So he gets his $3 million back, and then $2 million, which is 33% of the $6 million that's left. Remember, that sold for $9 million. $9 million subtract the 3 that he gets back, that leaves $6 million. He gets 33% of that, or another $2 million. So he gets a total of $5 million, which actually, out of the $9 million, he gets roughly 55%, even though he only owned 33% of the company, because he gets his $3 million back first. Okay? So it says the impact of a liquidation preference. It really impacts it when it's a small sale that barely enough money even to pay back the original guy. So in this example, investor puts in $10 million for 10% of the company at a 1 times 1x liquidation preference. So he gets, if the company, and their example is wrong. It's got a typo in it, so I corrected that. It says if the company sells, he says 10 million, but it's really supposed to be 20 million to make this example work. If a company sells for $20 million, the investor gets his $10 million back plus 10%, because he gets 10%, he owns 10% of the company. So 10% of the remaining 10 million, remember, $20 million minus 10, there's 10% remaining. He owns 10% of what's remaining. So he gets another $1 million. So 10 million plus 1 million is 11 million. Okay, so this should be 11 million. He has it as 21 million. So the investor gets 11 million out of the $20 million of the company. So he gets 55% of the proceeds. This is of the proceeds. That's not his return. That's just what percent of the proceeds from the sale or bankruptcy. So in a small liquidation like that, it really affects it, because this guy ended up getting 55%. But now just look at the company sold for 300 million. Okay, if the company sells for 300 million, the same investor, he gets his 10 million back plus 10% of the remaining. So 300 million minus his 10 million means there's 290 million remaining. He gets 10% of that, which is 29 million of this. This should be remaining equals 29 million. God, this guy made so many mistakes. But since he got 10 million plus 29 million, that equals 39 million. So 39 million divided by the 300 million, he got 13% of the total proceeds, which was the proceeds from the sale of the bankruptcy were 300 million. Oh, 10 million plus, okay, so he was right here. 10 million plus the 10% equals 10%, which is 290 million. He should have made that clearer. So he gets his 10 million plus 10% of 290, which is 29 million. So you add those two together, 10 million plus 29 million equals 39 million. It's just kind of written poorly. Preferred participating stock. Okay, so that was a liquidation event, and the preference for a liquidation event. This is preferred participating stock, which they call double dipping. In this case, the preferred stock investor takes their liquidation preference, which we kind of went over, which is usually only 1 times. That's what they'll usually use. Then they take their participating preferences, both off the top. Then the rest is divided up proportionally. Remember, the participating preferences are just little added extras that these guys get for their initial investment. So let's take a look at the example. Assume the VC invested $10 million for 10%, right? So he gets a one-time liquidation preference, which we just went over liquidation preferences, and a 2x participating with a 2x participating preferred stock. So the company sells for $10 million. His liquidation preference is that he gets $10 million, and then he gets a 2x participation. So 2 times the 10 million is another 20 million out of the remaining 20 million. So he gets 30 million. He gets 100% of everything, and that didn't even account for the 10% he would have gotten after that if there was anything left. So with the liquidation preference, he gets 1x his investment back initially. With his participation preference, he gets 2x what he invested, and then after that he gets 10% of what's left. In this case, there was nothing left, so he only got the $30 million. He got everything, which is 100% of the proceeds. Now let's look. So, and again, in a smaller proceeds, that affects the distribution significantly for the preferred stockholder. Now let's take a look at preferred participation where the company is worth more. In this case, $60 million. Same investor, liquidation preference. He gets his $10 million back. Then he gets 2x his investment is a participation preference of 10 million. So now that's 30 million he's got. There's 30 million left. Then he gets, because he owned 10%, he gets 10% of that 30 million, which is 3 million. So now he's got $33 million. So 10 plus 20 plus 3 equals, they said 70%. There's another mistake. 33 million divided by 60 million is 55%. These guys made some mistakes on this stuff. Okay, so now that's a medium size. Now if it's large size, it doesn't affect as much. So in the first case, since it was so small, he got 100% of the proceeds. This is like medium size. He still got 55%. Remember, he still has the same liquidation preference and the same preferred participation, or the participating preferences. In all three cases, it's just, it's a bigger liquidation. Of course, this has to do with the liquidation. So the liquidation preference stays the same. It's 1 time, so he gets 10 million. Then his participation preference is 2 times, so he gets 2 times his investment so he gets 2 times 10 million is 20 million. That leaves 270 million left. Now, since he had a 10% ownership of the company, right? He owned 10% with that initial investment. So he gets 10% of the ownership that's left. So out of 10% of 270 million is 27 million. So he gets 10 plus 20 plus 27 is 57 million. Divided by 300 million is 19% of the proceeds. One final note, there are many nuances to this, including the effects of multiple liquidation preferences and participation amounts across different financing rounds. They're not going to ask you a question like this in the final that complicated. Just know these ones that we just went over. It says, get a good lawyer and a good entrepreneurial finance advisor to help you, though. Okay, so that's the end of this handout.